Today I want to talk about McDowell. A class on mind and world is in itself sort of a joke as an idea. It's not clear exactly how you're supposed to cover this book or even the basic ideas of it in anything like that short of frame. What I want to do, I also am sort of aware of the fact that some of you know very little about McDowell and some of you know a lot. And I'd like to try to say some things that could be interesting for both constituencies, and tried to prepare today in a way that might serve that purpose. My aim today really is not to try to fully explain McDowell's ideas, let alone, say, try to defend them, but to simply locate him with respect to the dialectic of the course that we've laid out so far. So, first of all, what I want to be trying to show you is the sense in which the problematic of mind and world has a Kantian structure. Now, in one sense of Kantian, that's a fairly banal and unchallenging claim. I mean, he's quite explicit about his, the shape of his thought bearing some sort of allegiance to Kant. But what I mean by that is more specifically a Kantian problematic in the sense that I've tried to outline it in the previous weeks. More particularly, the sense in which you would be mistaking what's going on in the book if you took the shape of the problematic to be one of a merely Cartesian form. So I'm going to try to bring that out. That's one of my aims for today. Another one of my aims, and I think there's a very common way, or a family of very common ways of misunderstanding McDowell that turn on missing that point, or a point that can be put that way once we have the terminology of Cartesian and Kantian. So I think this can be helpful for people who are quite familiar with McDowell. A second thing I want to do today, which also I think should be helpful to anyone, is to try to bring out the ambition of the book and the generality of its concern. Something I think that's often missed is that although he does set up the discussion in terms of an issue in philosophy of perception, you will have really, in a quite profound sense, misunderstood this book if you think its concern is merely to make a contribution to the philosophy of perception. That is, the book is working very hard to come up with a characterization of what goes wrong in this area of philosophy of perception that has a certain kind of generality. That's partly why things are formulated in the sometimes seemingly metaphorical, abstract way they are, is to try to get at what he thinks is a fundamental shape of philosophical mind that he thinks pervades contemporary philosophy. And philosophy of perception is just one example of that. So I take it, McDowell, I'm going to be urging that you haven't really understood the book unless you understand McDowell's concern with a set of issues that he thinks have great scope in philosophy. So there's various asides where he tries to make the connections between these areas of philosophy, and I think they're often sort of missed on many readings. So I'm going to be drawing some attention to one of those to try to help make the more general point. But the general point with respect to how it fits with the class, that this second aspect of what I'm going to be doing today is concerned with, is the following. That McDowell is someone, I take it, who's concerned with the Kantian problematic, but part of what he's concerned with is trying to bring out the overall shape of the Kantian problematic as it occurs across different areas of philosophy. Part of what he's trying to do is get a characterization of it such that one could recognize a recurrence of a problem of that shape, so that one could see that an appropriate diagnosis and treatment of it has to be at a sufficiently fundamental enough level that one's actually treating what he takes to be the root of the problem and not, as it were, merely its symptoms. So there's much concern in mind and world, in a sense, with something like distinguishing the symptoms of certain kinds of philosophical puzzlement or anxiety or difficulty from what is the real underlying problem as he understands it. And much criticism of other people along the lines of, not that I disagree with what they say or they don't have a point, but as a general treatment of this problem, this is much too shallow. And trying to bring out what that kind of difference between McDowell and many people who look upon him as a co-traveler is. I think one can get at that by trying to see the sense in which what he's trying to do is something that, put in the vocabulary of the previous classes, we can put this way, trying to bring out the generic character of the Kantian problematic. Now, to do that, in a way, the easiest thing for me to have done, if I wanted to make it easy for myself, would have been to bring out how what he has to say about perception perfectly parallels what he has to say about philosophy of language and rule following. Because that's another case he discusses in some detail in the later lectures in Mind and World, and in much detail in his other writings. So the parallel could be made very, very vivid. But I decided not to do that. What I thought might be more interesting to do is look at one of the places where he draws a connection rather briefly. There are many of these, but look at one of them and really see how seriously he means it. Because it's by seeing how seriously he means those remarks that one can see what his own understanding is of what he's trying to do in the book. So the case I'm going to look at isn't the third case we had in our opening class. It's the philosophy of language case, but the fourth case we had in our opening classes, namely the philosophy of action case, which is one that sort of figures in a lot of McDowell's writings as something he briefly points at. So far, at least, he hasn't written much continuously on philosophy of action, but he means the parallels quite seriously. So I thought that would be an interesting place to go. If there's a sense in which if we can't rehearse what he's saying about philosophy, what he's saying, and apply it to philosophy of action, we haven't really understood it. It seems to be a point that somehow can't come free of his particular treatment of issues in the philosophy of perception, then either we haven't understood McDowell, or McDowell himself is very mistaken about what he's doing. One or the other. So that's the goal today. That's part of the goal today. We'll get on to other things, as you'll see, but that's enough by way of introduction. So first, let's just look. I've picked some remarks. The first few quotations, the first three quotations, to be precise, are some remarks from the opening pages, where he's trying to discuss the bind he thinks people get into in philosophy of perception. But I've tried to pick remarks in which he's putting this in fairly generic or abstract terms, and to bring out the point of that, being that the diagnosis is one that's not supposed to apply merely to philosophy of perception. So let's look at these. I've also tried to pick out some stuff that will make the continuity and concern, that, in my view, non-accidental continuity and concern between McDowell's topic in the opening chapters of this book and what we were talking about 2 classes ago in Lewis. Very explicit. So in the first quotation, he's talking about empirical thinking. And there's a thought, which we had in Lewis, that if we're going to make sense of our cognitive capacities, our thinking has to be active. It involves construction, involves interpretation, involves something we bring to experience. The word that McDowell hits particularly to make this point, an equally Kantian word, is freedom. That there has to be, in that sense, an element of freedom in any cognitive activity. So initially the topic of this first quotation is the freedom in empirical thinking. So there's this point that you have in Kant, which is that all cognition seems to involve an element of spontaneity. You could put it in a kind of more banal sort of contemporary philosophy of science way, or philosophy of language way, by saying, any description of the world involves concepts, and concepts involve a choice of concepts. There isn't anything which is the privileged system of concepts. And so some moment of choice, or some at least arbitrary element of selection seems required in the apparatus we bring to our description of the world. So freedom, this moment looks in one sense necessary, but this point can also seem to threaten a story about empirical thinking, and as we saw in Lewis, specifically a story about perceptual knowledge. If the freedom is total, is the way McDowell puts it in the first clause of your first quotation, the way Lewis put this is if our concepts are not constrained by anything outside the sphere of conceptual activity, if it's total, it's not constrained from outside the conceptual sphere, that clause is almost lifted from Lewis. I don't mean he's read Lewis and lifted it. I meant if you're in the Kantian problematic, you find yourself saying things like this. That can seem to threaten the very possibility that judgments of experience might be grounded in a way that relates them to a reality external to thought. So we need this moment of freedom, spontaneity, activity, concepts that are ours. However you want to put this. I picked McDowell's word for the moment. We've seen other ways of putting this. On the other hand, we need external constraint. is a very abstract way of putting the desiderata. We need something that makes these concepts the right concepts to use, and something that makes a judgment or a description about how things are, thus formulated, a true one rather than a false one. Not just a game in which we're playing with those concepts. So where do we get external constraint from? So there's a threat. The initial threat. First, there's an empiricist picture in which you see that knowledge involves the senses or passivity. And there's a problem. That doesn't seem to add up to a story about knowledge. That just seems to add up to a story in which the objects are sort of stamping themselves on our senses. The equivalent of a punch in the nose, sensorily speaking. And, this doesn't have any particular representational content any more than something impinging on my senses does. So it looks like we need something more. So we say freedom. But if we identify the concepts we have exclusively with this moment of freedom in which we bring the concepts to bear, without what the senses supply constraining in some way, then it seems like we have a kind of unbounded freedom which comes down to a kind of emptiness. So we say, no external strength. The external restraint must ground, justify, select, have at least, to put it very minimally, have a bearing on which concepts we choose when and why. Looks like there seems to be some relation of bearing here. Lewis, as you recall, spoke more specifically of guidance at this point. We need that if what we have over here, when we have the moment of freedom, which is supposed to be a story about empirical judgment, it's supposed to be a story about empirical judgment. I tend for the American spelling. McDowell tends for the English spelling. I don't care which. Your spell check might, depending upon which branch of Microsoft produced it. The thought is, without external constraint, this isn't recognizably a story of empirical judgment at all, says McDowell. So, we need external constraint. So this is the beginning of a problem. Then the problem is, when we try to have a story about external constraint, how do we tell the story? Well, initial way of telling the story is to say, well, the external constraint comes in the form of what we sense. What do we sense? Well, we could say something like sensory impressions. I have an impression of a chair. And then what quickly came to be the problem, as we saw Lewis insisting, so it looks like you can't even have that without a concept. You can have a sensation. The sensation might, involve some particular wavelength. But that doesn't involve something that has the shape of a claim. X is phi. This is a chair, or this is red, to take a concept that might seem even somehow possible to buy even more cheaply. That concept itself has boundaries of application that, at least in English, exclude, for instance, orange, though it shades quite naturally into orange. Excludes brown, though it shades into it. So impressions don't look like they can just be of something. If that's what comes externally without concepts, is just impressions that are conceptually unstructured, if that's what the given is, then it's hard to see how the given can play a warranting or grounding or guiding or constraining function. That's already coming up in quotation 2. The idea of the given is the idea that the space of reasons, the space of justifications or warrants, extends more widely than the conceptual sphere, McDowell says. Now, actually, I think what he should have said here, and I think later things he wrote suggest he'd be happy with this amendment. What he should have said here, I think, is the mythical idea, or the mythical conception of the given, is one according to which I think the capitalizing is partly meant to bring out that it's not just an idea of external. He's not trying to throw out the idea of external constraint. The given is that which constrains externally. The point isn't to throw that out. But there's a particular idea of it, capitalized, the thing that Sellars was trying to criticize off of the discussion in Chapter 1. And his particular way of putting that here. And one thing I want to show you is how carefully he's actually put this. And part of the reason why. This is a point at which McDowell is often already misunderstood. So, perfect example of someone who I think misunderstands him is his colleague Robert Brandon, who has been talking to him in the same philosophy department with offices next door to each other for 18 years. So it gives you some idea of, in fact, there's something slippery here. So this is, I'm sorry I don't have this on your hand. I didn't have this book. I borrowed it from Richard just before class, but it seems to me a nice way of making the point about the specificity of how McDowell's putting things in quotation too. So this is Empiricism, Philosophy and the Mind, Sellars' book, his essay, reprinted as a book, with a study guide by Brandom. I suppose one sort of implicit point I'm making here, which I don't have much time to elaborate, is don't believe the study guide. That is, the study guide isn't a very good guide to Sellars. It's an excellent guide to Brandom's thought, I think. But right now we just want to ask, so what is the given, or what is the myth of the given? Brandom says, the myth of the given is the idea there can be a kind of awareness that has two properties. First, that it's a kind of knowledge. It's a kind of state that can be right or wrong. It's a state that you're in simply in virtue of, that you possess simply in virtue of being in it, that knowledge. That's the first thing. The second thing is that this capacity to have this kind of awareness, being a state of knowledge, is something that doesn't presuppose any concepts. That's the myth. It's a kind of knowledge, can be right or wrong, can have the kind of vulnerability that excess phi has to these circumstances. This is a chair, this is red. But you can be in that state simply by exercising unacquired capacities. You don't need to acquire concepts. Say simply, maybe in virtue of your capacity to sense. That would be one story of the given. So he's trying to give it some generality. If you have the way Brandom's put it, it's a little more general than that. If you think, for instance, having an innate idea implanted into you somehow, without having to learn any language or to have any acquired capacities kick in, is a way of being in that state, that would still be a version of the given for him. So he's put it with some generality. And I actually think that gloss on the idea of a certain mythical conception of the given fits section 1 of Empiricism, Philosophy of Mind pretty well. That is, if you read only 1/16 of the way into the essay, then actually the study guide's doing fine. I think the study guide is already, it's still on part 1. But the thing about Brandom, as you'll see, is that he identifies the myth of the given with that particular version of it. Whereas I think it's exactly what Sellars isn't doing. He's saying this is a rather superficial guide, sense datum theories. And then he continues to deepen the characterization. But what I'm interested in now is Brandom goes on to put that same point in a number of different ways by pointing at various people. One thing he does is he quotes McDowell in the footnote. He said, as McDowell puts the point. And we get a quotation from McDowell. Look at that in a minute. He also goes on to Sellars and says that Sellars' crucial argument is that these two features, being in the state of knowledge that can be correct or incorrect, and it's being unacquired, these two features are incompatible. That's Sellars' critical point, he says. So he takes that to exhaust the attack. And then he also cites Davidson. Davidson expresses another version of this thought with the slogan, nothing can count as a reason for holding a belief except another belief. So his thought is, nothing unacquired can play this role, so merely acquired stuff does. To fall into the myth of the given is not to agree with Davidson at this point. So Brandom is setting a big equal sign between all of these things. Now that is going to be misunderstanding McDowell in about 5 ways at once. But let's just mention a couple of them. One misunderstanding is, we'll see that although one of McDowell's targets here is the myth of the given, another one of his targets is a kind of coherentism that he associates. He associates in this chapter with Davidson and Sellars. That's a mistake about Sellars, I think. I can come back to that. It's a scholarly footnote. But certainly Davidson and Brandom would have done fine. He says he's reading Sellars at this point still through Brandom's spectacles. He's taking Brandom's word for about who Sellars is, up to a point at least. Whereas McDowell wants to see those two views as pitted against each other and to take a different path. Brandom's saying the only way to avoid the given is to hold Davidson's view. The myth of the given, rejecting the myth of the given and agreeing with Davidson are the same point philosophically for Brandom. He's sort of closed the space. That's the less interesting. That's such a fundamental misunderstanding of McDowell in a way. It's not even interesting. I mean, that really misses everything in McDowell. But the more fundamental misunderstanding of McDowell is to merely identify the myth of the given with something like the kind of view he has here, thinking you could have concepts, or you could have something which requires concepts, like an articulated state of knowledge that has those sorts of normative conditions of correctness and incorrectness. That you could have that simply in virtue of an unacquired capacity, like your senses. If that's all there was to the myth of the given, then think back to Lewis. Lewis would be one of the great enemies of the myth. Lewis's point, as we saw in that chapter you read, is the given by itself doesn't even figure in our awareness. Not only couldn't it be true or false, but you never even just have an element of the given. In order for something to be a cognitive state, it must be conceptually structured in some way. One of the things it must be, for instance, is shareable, which already requires concepts and language, he thinks. And conversely, he thinks that, Lewis thinks, this is where he's disagreeing with Brandon, that just having concepts by itself wouldn't give you very much unless they were somehow constrained by the given. So, Lewis is a critic of the myth of the given, explaining the way Branham explains it. But then Branham has his footnote. He says, as McDowell puts the point, which he takes to be the same thing. Here's how McDowell puts the point. The idea of the given is the idea that the space of reasons, we're on quotation 2 of your handout also. So I'm reading McDowell. It's quoting, Branham's quoting McDowell, quoting your handout. The idea of the given is the idea the space of reasons, the space of justifications or warrants, extends more widely than the conceptual sphere. This way of putting it does make contact with Lewis. What Lewis wants to say is, yes, what we ordinarily call justification, that requires concepts. Any state of consciousness requires concepts. Anything we ordinarily call knowledge, that requires concepts. But Lewis's worry was, but we still need, and here's part of the difference between McDowell and Branham, or McDowell and Davidson. McDowell's taking this worry that Lewis has seriously. We need some kind of external constraint. But Lewis then thinks, well, you can't get that external constraint unless there's some sort of relation of guidance from the realm of our natural capacities. Let's call them natural capacities, where this, for Lewis, does mean something like capacities we have ab initio, without any sort of Bildung being required. It's an unacquired capacity. We need some sort of constraint that's applied on our conceptual capacities. The exercise of these must be constrained by those where neither limits the other. That was that quotation I emphasized in Lewis, where this is really independent of that. This bears on that from the outside. So this idea that there must be something that constrains the conceptual sphere from the outside, that's exactly the way McDowell talks. That perfectly captures Lewis's picture. And then you saw how hard it was for Lewis to tell a story. And Lewis himself knew it was hard. He wanted a story about qualia. He wanted a story about something that had the kind of generality you need to have something built into it so it can play a guiding function. No particular can do that. And yet he wanted the kind of generality, universality that attaches to these things to be of a generically different sort than falling under a concept. Because then he realized he's just slipping back in the concepts, the guidance of which is supposed to constitute their acquisition. So he's trying to avoid that circle. So that difficulty that Lewis had, which McDowell thinks anyone's going to have who thinks hard about this, is exactly the kind of view that McDowell's trying to capture by putting this in a very different way than Branham does. So one difference is he's taking this worry seriously. The second is that he's trying to come up with a characterization of the myth of the given that then captures all sorts of different views that are trying to hang on to this demand in a way that he thinks won't work, not just the particular way that Branham has in view. Just a little historical footnote might be in order here. I think that if you read later things by McDowell, you'll see his reading of Sellars has changed a lot. He stopped taking Branham's word for who Sellars is. So, Sellars, too, is attached to much more careful and fundamental ways of putting what the myth of the given is than the one that Branham relies upon in just basing his characterization in the opening of the Sellars essay. And in particular, Sellars is interested in criticizing Lewis. That is, Sellars, the way Sellars puts the myth, he never puts it McDowell's way, but a way Sellars puts it is to say something like, the very idea that we could have repeatable sense determinables, the very idea that we could have something that has the character of something that can be further determined, that has conditions of correctness or incorrectness, but itself does not presuppose concepts, is a mistake. Another way to put this is the very idea that we could be possessed of something you might call sensory classificatory consciousness. A consciousness which can classify things in ways that something counts as having classified it correctly or incorrectly. Or another way of putting it is the idea that you could have a consciousness that looks in the world and recognizes something as the same again, where there's a determinate content to that achievement of recognition. So you could later say, it could say to itself, I made a mistake. It isn't the same again. Not just that it was surprised or frustrated, and it started going, because the food wasn't there. But it actually had a grasp of what it had committed itself to in holding the one state of consciousness, such that he could see the other state of consciousness had falsified that commitment. The building in of that kind of structure into what happens in perception is already presupposing, Sellars thinks, something that only comes with languages. It's taking a kind of structure that comes as we learn language and concepts and projecting it back to a stage of cognitions or sentience or percipience that doesn't yet and couldn't yet have it. But Sellars himself thinks, but we need external constraint. Sellars himself is a student of Lewis and shares this. I'm talking about the real Sellars now, not the one that's discussed in the first chapter of Mind and World, who's lumped together with Davison, but the real Sellars. He shares this worry. So Sellars, actually, like Lewis, is trying to tell a story about how sensations can guide our use of concepts without falling to the myth of the given. And his story gets really complicated. It involves something called picturing, for instance. She's an elaborate story, inspired by the Tractatus. You'll never see Branham talk about it anywhere when he writes about Sellars, even though Sellars writes about it a lot. But what's interesting is that McDowell's way, already in Mind and World, of putting the myth of the given, what he thinks is the fundamental myth, also places Sellars in the target range. Because this is still an attempt to constrain the conceptual sphere, in some sense normatively, from the outside. So when McDowell says, the idea of the given is the idea of the space of reasons, or justifications, or warrants, or constraints, or things that can introduce guidance, things that can give you a clue, or a sign, or an indication of which concept to apply. That extends more widely than the conceptual sphere. That's his fundamental way of putting the idea of the given. And that is a very careful formulation of what the myth is at the bottom level, which even once he reads Sellars and sees Sellars as having a very different view, he doesn't need to change. Sellars still falls into his target range. Sellars will still count as someone who, if he fully understood the myth of the given, has fallen into it for McDowell. Now, again, this is put extremely generically. So that he means to be capturing a point about philosophy of perception here. But as I'll try to show you, the point importantly extends from beyond philosophy of perception. So the next sentence is, the extra extent of the space of reasons is supposed to allow it to incorporate non-conceptual impacts from outside the realm of thought. So the thought is, whatever provides this external constraint, if we're doing philosophy of senses, that belongs to the senses and is due to a kind of structure or character they have as part of nature, that they have anyways, as nature is in itself. There's a certain conception of the natural world. There's a conception of the senses as part of the natural world. And we need to build up a story about what secures external constraint out of ingredients so conceived. Here, non-conceptual impacts. The impact still involves. I thought about this being philosophy of perception. We're impinging on mind or in senses. And then he said. Then I just quote something that he's summarizing. He's already tried to argue in the previous pages, and here he himself is building on Sellars. The thought is, anything conceived in those terms, if external constraint is conceived of as belonging to the realm of nature, so conceived. So I gave you a particular gloss on how to understand what falls into the realm of nature as it is in itself. And it's not an accident. A lot of people miss this, but if you see what McDowell's doing, it's not an accident that that's the notion he's trying to challenge in this book. A lot of people think it's sort of afterthought. He needs to say more. They sort of failed to see from the beginning that a certain assumption about what the character of that which must provide external constraint is has come into play here, and that has to be his target. That something that falls into nature thus conceived, a mere physical happening, whether the physical happening be between two billiard balls or a billiard ball hitting my optic nerve, or some other part of my nervously sensitive, merely physical body, that an event of that sort cannot constrain normatively. That to have that kind of constraint, you need a concept. It might be, for instance, that if you have an automatic door opener, so that if I step here, the door opens. Some supermarkets in America have this, somewhere in Norway. Automatic door opener. There's a causal hookup here. I step, door opens. You can hook things up so that you have that kind of reliable, differential, responsive disposition built into the door and the floor mat before it, thinking of those as one coordinated unit. But in order to have something happen that's true or false, like for instance, what might happen is if I'm sort of down the hallway, I'm sure there's some Clint Eastwood film where something like this happens, and this door suddenly opens. Clint knows there's a person standing here, and I'll be very decisive for this person eventually meeting one of Clint's bullets. But the thought, there's a person there, that can't be put in place simply in virtue of this hookup. That involves the concepts, a number of rather complicated concepts, but actually involves indexicals, it involves picking things out in space, it involves the concept of a person. If you change it, you think that's the wrong thing, you want to say, there's a something there that weighs more than so and so pounds. That doesn't change the point. You just substitute one set of concepts for another. The door opener is not in a position where it's got some view of the world, where it's true or false. We could change the hookup so it just opens without a person being there. And we haven't suddenly led the door opener to have all sorts of false beliefs. So in order to actually have something which has that kind of sensitivity, the kind of sensitivity such that there can be that kind of accord or lack of accord between the sensory state, aha, there's a person there. That can't be a result merely of something impinging on us. That impingement, however we understand it, is going to have some further structure. It can't just be A causes B in a merely efficient natural law sense of causation that belongs to this picture. That's the claim that he's relying on, which he's taking from Sellars. So, external constraint, so conceived, cannot impinge on the conceptual realm. It can't tell us which concepts to use and which not. Or to put the point a little more broadly, as Davidson and Brandon do, it cannot offer any element of justification. What Brandon and Davidson conclude from that, and there's some stand-in targets for another possible view here in McDowell, although he has Sellars. I say that's wrong, so I say Brandon and Davidson rather than Sellars. What they conclude is, well, the only thing that can justify a belief or some structured set of concepts putting forward a claim is another one of those, another belief, or another string of concepts structured so as to form a claim. So, justification on this story is, as it were, imminent to this sphere of concepts understood purely as exercises of freedom, understood as things initially that don't have any empirical content. And then you got to tell some story, otherwise it looks very satisfying, about how this causal hookup makes some sort of difference somebody should care about. But you still have a story in which whatever it's doing, it's never justifying. And Brandon, in particular, I think, has a heroically complicated story where he tries to make this matter, even though he concedes the point that external constraints so conceived could never justify anything. So they take that conclusion to mean all justification must be imminent to the sphere of beliefs. Experience cannot justify. Brandon even goes further and says, experience isn't even one of my words. I'm very proud it's not in the index of making it explicit. I don't even use it. It's just a name for a bad idea. Experience is something that somehow through perceiving could bear on our beliefs. He just wants to throw that out. Very radical response. But the radicality of the response comes from something philosophically percipient, namely realizing how deep this problem is. Now, so you get another view, the coherentism view, by saying this story of the given always winds up filling this arrow with something that's empty or confused. So, we need to erase the arrow here, at least as far as there being any normative relation. We can allow for some kind of causal relation, because of course things in the realm of nature so conceived can cause things to happen. That's not a problem, including causing things to happen to us as physical and material beings. But all our justificatory arrows have to be drawn in this circle. But that just throws us back into the worry of quotation one. That throws us back into, that threatens the very possibility that judgments of experience might be grounded in a way that relates them to a reality external to thought. That's exactly what Lewis is worried about. When he says, but then our thoughts aren't true to anything. We must have external constraint. So we're back to going, better draw an arrow. Or, as McDowell puts it in quotation 3, it can be difficult to accept that the myth of the given is a myth. It can seem as if we reject the given, we merely reopen ourselves to the threat of the idea that the given is a response to, the threat that our picture does not accommodate any external constraint on our activity of thought and judgment, etc. So we come under pressure, end of the quotation, to recoil back into appealing to the given. And then he thinks if we think it through again, and maybe in the slightly deeper version of qualia or whatever, it's only to see all over again that it cannot help. Last sentence of the third quotation. There is a danger of falling into an interminable oscillation. So McDowell wants to diagnose certain exchanges as happen in the history of philosophy as one in which you can see people going back and forth between the option of trying to draw this constraint external to the sphere of conceptual activity. That very general way of putting it makes any version of that a myth of the given. So you have this circle, and an arrow between them, external to the sphere of activity. Any version of that, he's saying, won't work. And any solution to that, which just erases the arrow and says all justification therefore happens merely within a sphere of conceptual activity that is not normatively constrained from without, raises the other problem, which is just as deep. So he's trying to give a level of characterization where neither of those views can work. Many things are versions of both of those views. And you can see the many things that come up as reactions to each other, so that there is what he calls a seesaw effect. A seesaw is a thing like this, where this guy stands here, it goes like that. If this guy stands there, it goes like that.
Yeah.
And something like that he thinks is happening. Yes, Mikhail, do you have a question?
I think these two concepts you show now, the one with the arrow and the without arrow, they are both linear. They're kind of linear. Obviously linear. And I think that the whole claim is kind of an approach to a dialectic form of thinking, if I might use this word. The kind of balancing, like the thing you were thinking on before.
Well, I think McDowell might be sympathetic to that. But what I want to do right now, actually, is not... what I'm trying to do right now is I'm moving again, maybe frustratingly slowly for you. But I'm not even going to try to say what's wrong with this at the moment, or even yet what McDowell thinks is wrong with this in any deep way. But what I want to do is give him a story about philosophy of perception. And what I want to do next is just, as a level of description, bring out how general it is. That is, how it doesn't just hold in perception. So that would make us interested in a way of putting your solution, if it is a solution, so it can spread with that generality. But conscious of the fact that Scotland and Norway are about to play each other, maybe we should take a 10-minute break. So we ended with a picture of a seesaw, an interminable oscillation. And then McDowell says, quotation 4, we can dismount the seesaw if we can achieve a firm grip on this thought. This is, page 9 of the book. So one thing should be clear is that he thinks that achieving a firm grip on this thought is actually very hard to do. The whole book is sort of trying to help people to achieve a firm grip on this thought. So there's a kind of specious clarity about what he says in the next sentence. If we can achieve a firm grip on this thought. And then this is how he puts it. Receptivity does not make an even notionally separable contribution to the cooperation. Or to fill out the formula a little bit. We think of understanding as something like our intellectual capacity, the realm of our intellectual capacity. And we think of receptivity as those capacities we have in virtue of our nature, or our being natural beings. The latter does not make an even notionable contribution to the cooperation of the pair. Even notionally separable contribution to the cooperation of the pair. There's a lot one could say about that. I'm going to say only a little now and then approach it from a different direction. But first thing I want to say, again, is that I think that's an unfortunate formulation in his part. That is, I don't think he's saying here what it turns out he has to mean by the time he's done. And I suspect you'll find him saying this somewhere in some of his writings soon. I don't think the point is that receptivity cannot make an even notionally separable contribution. The point is that it cannot make an actually separable contribution. There cannot be, to borrow Descartes' vocabulary, a real distinction between the contribution that sensibility makes and the understanding makes. What there can be is a notionally separable one. The possibility of a notionally separable one is, as it were, what the very formulation of the point depends upon. So to borrow a bit of vocabulary from Kant, which is perhaps helpful here, Kant sometimes talks about a merely analytical unity. A merely analytical unity is a unity in which we have some things that co-occur, and we can, for purposes of abstraction, abstract out one feature or another. The most famous, straightforward case of this in history philosophy, which I think plays a large role in Kant's using this vocabulary for all kinds of things in the critique, is Aristotle's example of form and matter. You can distinguish between something's form and its matter, but at least on an understanding of Aristotle, wherever you have form, you have some matter. And wherever you have a form, wherever you have matter, it is in some form or other. What we call formless matter is not matter that has no form at all. It's matter that has kind of uninteresting form. It looks like a dropped egg, perhaps. That's a form. So form and matter is a merely analytical unity. But they are notionally separable. The problem is they are merely notionally separable. So I think McDowell's point similarly about sensibility and understanding at the end should be something like, makes a merely notional separation. For some purposes we can treat it as an analytic unity, distinguish these things and ask how they're related. But then what we have to see is that what we've divided in analysis cannot be divided in actuality. Now, what I want to bring out next, because time is rushing by, is how the kind of point he makes about the philosophy of perception, here, the kind of point he makes off of the example of the philosophy of perception, might be the way to put this, is supposed to have general significance for him. He's trying to bring out, as I put it, a characteristic philosophical bond. What happens, he thinks, if you think through this problem in philosophy of perception is, if you're stuck in this oscillation, it becomes mysterious how it is that our judgments could so much as have empirical content. Or, to put it in more perceptual terms, how our perceptual experiences could so much as be about something. Or to put it in Kant's language, how they could be even something that adds up to less than a dream, something more than less than a dream. So, but that worry is a consequence of a certain way of separating out our cognitive or intellectual or conceptual capacities, for a certain way of factorizing those from a certain understanding of our natural capacities, and then having a certain kind of problem arise about how does one impinge on the other. And in one solution one says, well, it impinges by somehow providing justification. And he said, well, it can't be justification in the ordinary sense. Well, it provides a kind of constraint or information or guidance of a special sort. But the special sort seems to involve a problem saying what the special sort is in a non-problematic way. And then we try to say, well, it doesn't then. We have our natural capacities and we have our intellectual capacities, and we get a kind of dualism back. One of the things that's striking in a way about thinkers like Davidson and Branham is how dualistic they are. Not in the Cartesian, traditional Cartesian sense of two ontological realms, but in a story about the natural realm and the constitutive ideal of rationality, as Davidson puts it. And they sort of sit on top of each other as orders of intelligibility. It's very hard to see how one can bear on the other. Davidson's anomalous monism is one way of trying to tell a story that lets them have something to do with each other while sitting on top of each other. And McDowell wants to diagnose that feature of the picture as already the source of the thing that leads to the Kantian problematic. So he says, and so what he's introducing, he describes as a kind of relaxed naturalism, as a conception of nature in which we don't see our intellectual capacities themselves as external to our natural capacities. But rather than exploring what kind of solution that is, I want to show right now how he thinks this structure problem comes up everywhere by looking at an example we discussed this only very briefly. So he says in page 89, in introducing my picture and its attractions, I have explored philosophical difficulties about perceptual experience. But this focus was not essential. The difficulties exemplify a type. That's the point I'm trying to bring up now. He does this especially later on by looking at rule following and the debate between people who want to be Platonists and a certain kind of anti-realism and the rejection of Platonism and rule following. But let's look at it with respect to the case he discusses only briefly right after he makes that remark, namely philosophy of action. One way he gives here in the beginning of quotation 6 of summarizing a kind of problem that comes up in philosophy of perception is to say, the problem is that operations of sensibility are actualizations of a potentiality that is part of our nature. When we take sensing to be, or we might say, to merely be, a way of being acted on by the world, we understand sensing is just a transaction in the realm of nature, understood as an object of scientific study, where something just happens to our senses. We are thinking of as a natural phenomena, and then we have trouble seeing how a sui generis spontaneity, an ability to traffic in concepts, and use them this way rather than that way, based on the kind of rational and inferential relations they stand into one another. We have trouble seeing how that kind of relation between entities, one of being reasons for, being grounds for something, could be anything but externally related to it. So, a little further down, I'm skipping here. You should read through these pages in Mind and World yourself to get the between framework. Just trying to give you a snapshot. He says, consider a different case. The capacity to move one of one's limbs. Consider that as it appears in the framework of a naturalism that leaves nature disenchanted. The result is a similar difficulty in our reflection about bodily action. So he wants to say, just like considering the senses as something that's normatively inert, trying to think of it as an element in the process of cognition, but as such, something that's just the terminus of a causal transaction, that gets into a problem that's exactly structurally equivalent. And note, this is a descriptive claim. Maybe we're just screwed in both areas. But the point right now is the problems are structurally equivalent, whatever the solution is. So that's why in a moment I'm bracketing McDowell's solution, whatever it is. And just noticing he's making a claim about the shape of the problems, which is already interesting. You could actually agree with him about this and disagree with him about his solution. He wants to say you get into a similar problem by thinking of action as something which involves a moment, which is supposed to come in view through a description of someone making a merely bodily movement of a certain sort. Where the question then is going to be, how's that related to our capacities of thought? Now the problem has certain external features that might look quite different. So seeing why he thinks these are the same is what I want to try to bring out now. He himself tries to do it a bit in quotation 8 by saying, Kant says, thoughts without content are empty, intuitions without concepts are blind. Similarly, now McDowell, intentions without overt, missing T, intentions without overt activity are idle. Movements of limbs without concepts are mere happenings, not expressions of agency. Now, let's not misunderstand this. McDowell's not saying you can't exercise your capacity of sensibility unless you're simultaneously exercising your capacity of understanding. He's understanding Kant's point to be that you couldn't have any intuitions unless you had some concepts. The point isn't about the exercise of the capacities, but the having of the capacities. Just like no one would doubt that you can utter a word without uttering a sentence. The question is, could you be somebody who really understands what a word means without understanding any sentences? Or understand what a sentence means without understanding a word? That's not so clear. Some people think, McDowell actually thinks something similar in this area, that the capacity for, as it were, forming sentences, and the capacity, that is, our syntactical capacities, and our capacities for understanding words, and the referential capacities that those involve, presuppose each other. But no one doubts that you can, as it were, locally, you can give something a syntactical schema. You can say, X equals Y, without having referred to anything particular. Those can be variables. No one doubts you can do that. The question is, would you understand what you're doing if you did that? If you had no idea how to put anything but something that functioned as a variable in the place that those schema suggest is there to be filled. So, similarly, a question about, would there be anything, can we make sense of a notion of intention kind of sense can we make of a notion of intention if the notion of intention in question is only externally related to the idea of an activity which realizes the intention? And similarly about agency, where we're thinking of activity now not as mere movements of limbs, but as things describable as you decided to close the door. Could that have any content? Is closing the door as something that could be represented as the conclusion of a practical syllogism? Could such a description have content independently of some conception of the being's intentional capacities? McDowell says, I've urged that we can accommodate the point of Kant's remark only if we accept this claim: experiences or actualizations of our sentient nature in which conceptual capacities are inextricably implicated. The parallel is intentional bodily actions or actualizations of our active nature in which conceptual capacities are inextricably implicated. So let's see what this looks like. Before I do, I just want to point out one further feature of what he thinks, which is, say there's a claim he's trying to sell us in quotation A, which we can buy or not. But what I'm interested in is where we are if we don't buy that claim, and his description of that. What kind of shape does our view have? And he has a description of that in 9. If we have a view of the natural moment in this equation, be it the sentient one or the one that involves action, if we have a conception of that which excludes the understanding as being able to involve actualizations of the sentient nature or the active nature, we're going to wind up with a picture, he says, that has certain characteristic results. The exclusion has characteristic results when we reflect about action. Shut out the realm of happenings constituted by movements of ordinary natural stuff. And the spontaneous agency typically tries to take up residence in a specifically conceived interior realm. The realm of spontaneity may be seen as a renunciation of naturalism, or the interior realm may be conceived as a special region of the natural world. So, make this a little less opaque. If we think ourselves as sensing, we understand what's happening at the level of sentience as being a merely causal impact. Then we're going to have to understand what it is to have a perceptual experience that's conceptually structured initially as happening in a space that's completely separate from that space. A space which is happening on the inside of the conceptual realm, external to that happening. You get what McDowell calls an interiorizing shape to your picture. Interiorizing initially just means inside this circle. But the tendency is actually to interiorize it literally and to think, well, yes, in his mind, he's having such and such an experience. The content of experience and the place of the thing that has that content, that's inside. And then on the surface of his body where the sentience happens, the optic nerve, well, that's something merely physical. And we try to follow out the physical part, and we're looking for some way to hook it up. The thing that's supposed to have this other shape. And there's this now quite literal gap, not just figurative gap in our understanding of how these two kinds of intelligibility fit together. He wants to say, it doesn't matter now. The interiorizing move itself is the crucial symptom. We can then say, well, what's on the inside itself should all be understood as merely physical stuff somehow. But that's already taken the interiorizing move, which is a symptom of this fundamental assumption, and then running into a certain kind of trouble keeping the interiorizing consequence, and then just trying to understand the stuff that's merely interior as physical rather than mental. It's trying to solve a conceptual bind by changing the ontological character of one of the items that is located in this bind. Just one more sentence. He wants to say the same thing about philosophy of action. That if you have this story in which you have the intention and you have the action, you understand the action is simply an event that takes place in a physical space, then you're going to, that's the point of this quotation, interiorize the intention. You're going to think, well, where's the intention? Well, it's in some other space that's independent of that. Chances are you might think of that as, again, a mental space. So you understand the intention is something like, inchoately, a kind of a thing that's located in the head. And then you need to understand the relationship, and the kind of thing it is doesn't look anything like the kind of a thing an action is. You've interiorized it. And now we need to understand how you break out of the circle of interiorized intentions to something that's located in the space of merely physical acts. Sorry. Dixon had a question?
Yeah, I just want you to help me with this. He says in the quotation line that the spontaneity of agency typically tries to take up residence in a specifically conceived interior realm.
Yes, that's exactly what I was trying to talk about just now.
I want to get his conception of agency here, because I think it may help me to understand his idea about causality. I don't know whether he can throw more light on it.
Well, I think he thinks that, the problem isn't a problem of causality. It's a problem of understanding what the relata in the causal relation is. That, thinking hard about causality isn't what's going to solve the problem for you. But I think maybe I will help you with your question if we move on in the handout. I'll skip quotation 10. You can see what quotation 10 is about yourself. What I try to set this up a little more clear. First, I just wanted to give you the quotations. They're a little unclear, I think. And then we'll try to go back through this more slowly. That's the point of what happens next in the handout. So, trying to pick up on things I said when we were talking earlier about Lewis. Here's a traditional picture of perception. I mean this to be very schematic, so it fits people as different as, Schlick and Brandom and Lewis and Davidson, all kinds of people. Perception is a two-stage process. And I tried to show you how there are very different readings of Kant. I could keep that idea too a few classes ago. But a two-stage process. First, there's a non-conceptual episode, a sensing, understood as an unacquired feat, followed by a conceptually informed episode. So, two stages. First, an event in the space of a merely causally structured natural world. Something's perceptually impressing itself on us. Followed by an event in the space of reasons. That's supposed to be an exercise of our conceptual capacity. So this is an attempt to just summarize going this way, this picture. First something here, something here. Now, I'm going to try at the same level of description to bring out a common feature of a certain kind of problem in the philosophy of action. Action is a two-stage process. First you form an intention. I think I'll open the door. Stage one just happened. I think I'll open the door. Stage two. Open the door. Stage one, that's conceptually structured. My thinking I would open the door involves my having the concept door. It involves understanding the door is something I can know. It involves all kinds of understandings, which would come out very vividly. For instance, if I went outside and said, I think I'll jump over this building. It's quite unclear what I had just intended when I say, I think I'll jump over that building. That is, if I understand anything about myself, maybe I think I'll do two push-ups might, work or something I could, as it were, form an intention about. But I think I'll jump over that building suggests that, I haven't actually got a grip on the concepts with which I'm trying to form my intention. Thus, actually no intention has been formed. So, there are constraints, but the constraints have to do with understanding. What can count as a reason for something? What can count as having fulfilled the intention? And it involves things like knowledge of my capacities, knowledge of what instantiates the concepts. If I said things like, I think we should clear the snow in this room, there's a question raised about me, and one place you can worry is about, what I think the word snow means. But when I form the intention, I think I'll open the door. I'm doing quite well on all those. I seem to understand what door means. I seem to understand what would fulfill door. Those seem to think things that are relevant to my being able to do that. It doesn't look like a story about stuff taking place in space and time is what we need to understand, whether I form the intention. It involves questions like, am I being able to do well? With questions about that if you want to find out if I can do it. Rather than, a more interesting example would be things like, I think I'll go to the airport tomorrow. Not clear I can do that without some help. Though some of you no doubt could. Whereas the opening of the door itself the opening of the door looks like, prima facie, the kind of thing that could happen because the wind blew it open. Or imagine more fancifully, anyone who's been reading the news in New Orleans, hurricane comes along, blows me into the door. Jim opened the door. Well, sort of. He didn't do it by forming an intention to open the door. Elizabeth Anscombe has a nice case of, being caught up in a wind, and being blown downtown. So imagine there's two examples. One is I'm going downtown. I'm going to go downtown. I go downtown. Another example, a wind comes, and I'm being blown. And I say, I'm going downtown. True. But I'm not acting on an intention in any interesting sense. So how should we understand the opening of the door? Well, the tendencies think the opening of the door, well, that's just something that happened in the realm of nature. Both the one where I act on the intention and the one where I don't are cases of that same thing, non-equivocally understood. Something happened. Jim, as it were, did things such that the door opened. Opening the door might not be a great example because it involves some rather tricky maneuvers here, so maybe going downtown is better. Going downtown is something Jim can do, as an expression of his agency, or as an expression of Hurricane Katrina's tremendous force. But physically, it's the same thing happening. Even going downtown in a hurry, if you like. That's stage 2. So action's a 2-stage process. A conceptually informed episode, in item 2 here, in Roman 2, followed by a non-conceptual episode. First, an episode in the space of reasons, the forming of the intention with the specific content it has, such that it can be fulfilled or not. Something counts as it being, even if I don't open the door. We can still say I formed the intention, I failed to act on it. And an exercise, so that's an exercise of our conceptual capacities. Quite an elaborate one. Once I decide to go downtown or open the door, I might actually have to think about how to do it. I sure do when it comes to the airport. Followed by an event in the merely structured space of the natural world. A series of bodily movements. Or a series of bodies, or body moving. Now, if you put these two things next to each other, there's point 3. There are differences. In the first story, it's first something happening in the realm of nature, the episode of sentience, followed by something happening in the space of reasons, the forming of the conceptually structured experience. Things are thus and so. There's a red chair in front of me, which could be true or false, which could be fulfilled or disappointed, to use a more generic term, to bring out the parallel here. Whereas in the philosophy of action story I just showed, things unfold the other way. Event 1 is in the space of concepts, the forming of the intention, which could be fulfilled or disappointed. I think I'll go downtown, which could succeed or fail. Followed by the thing that happens in the physical world, the movement of my body. Now, but that, which happens first, as we've seen in the Cartesian cases, doesn't matter here either in these Kantian cases, for there to be the kind of parallel interest McDowell between these cases. It's not about this happens, then that happens. The question is, how do we understand the character of the relation that holds these together? In the one case, we're trying to understand what perceptual warrant could be, how something could happen in experience, such that it gives us a reason for believing something. In the second case, we're trying to understand how the forming of the intention could, in some interesting sense, be said to have brought about what I did, or be the reason that I come to be downtown, or the door opened. In the one case, it looks like we can't ever get a reason here. That's the most natural way to get the problem going. There are other ways. One very gripping way to get the problem going here is it could look like, as long as we stay at the level of intentions, we never really get a cause. We don't get something that causally interacts. It looks like you might think we have to go down a level of engineering to something that's happening in my biomatter before we have the thing that caused my hand to shoot out and do things. But then it's hard to see how any of that would be a reason either. It would look like that's just more causes. And so then it starts becoming hard to see how anything that my body does could be done for a reason. Now we have a version of Kantian skepticism again. It's hard to see how bodily agency could ever happen. We can see we have bodily movement, but how could what we're doing be things that are done for reasons, that are expressions of a will? It starts to look like there's no space for that. So this is again Kantian skepticism that we're having in now the intentional realm. Now, an interesting topic which I wanted to mark here, but I don't think we have time for today, but I'll just mark it as a future topic therefore for our class, is notice there is a connection between Cartesian and Kantian skepticism that matters a lot to McDowell, actually, as part of his understanding of how these things are connected, which is, in both cases, you have what we might call an understanding of the inner as a self-standing realm. In the Cartesian case, there was a perceptual sphere, or a sphere of the body where the pain was. In one case, I'm stuck inside my experiences. I don't know how the world is outside. Richard's pain is inside his body. I can't get to it. Those are two cases we discussed. We discussed others. Here we also have a kind of something that looks homologous, despite the differences in the Kantian problematic, which is, it looks like intentions are not the kinds of things that can cause. Intentions are, as it were, only things that can be related to other things that could be reasons. Not mere causes, I should say. I shouldn't just say cause, I should say mere causes, understood as the kinds of things that figure in such a way that you can't see the billiard ball itself or the door openers acting on a reason. So it looks like, again, you have a kind of conception of the realm. In the one case here of the conceptual, here in the action story of the intentional, as a realm that's enclosed in on itself, that doesn't look like it can interact with the very thing that it looks like it's supposed to be related to for it to be what it is. Because it would seem that the very notion of intention is idle. If you can't realize any of your intentions, nothing could count as you realizing any of your intentions. If it's just always a happy coincidence that when I decide to go downtown, a wind blows me down there, or some equivalent thereof, a sort of inner physiological wind propels me down. Whew, lucky coincidence. Just after I decided to go downtown, the stuff started happening. So, well, look at me go. You can see why a certain kind of divine harmony could look like a solution to a dualism problem. So what I'm trying to bring out here in 5 is how these are structurally parallel issues. If described at the right level of generality, we can go across these cases. We could have taken the philosophy of language case. The case could have been, here we have a mere marker sign, something described a certain way. And then the question would be, well, what counts as an understanding of that? We can talk about understandings and we can talk about marks. And there's going to be a similar question about how there could be a relation of the right sorts that bridges the character of things understood as mere marks from the character of things understood as, say, propositions. So there's a conceptual and a non-conceptual episode, and there's a relation. In the one case, being a reason or guiding, having some normative relation for how we apply our concepts. In the other case, rationally bringing about our action. So it's a different kind of relation. But in both cases, there's a conceptual and a non-conceptual episode understood. In the one case, in the perceptual process, understood as a two-stage process. In the other case, in the intentional action, understood as a two-stage process. One stage is described one way, the other stage is described the other way. And then we need to move between them. And there's a philosophical puzzle arises about how there could be a relation such that these are both stages of a single process united in the right way. And this raises a question which we could go back to in terms of the vocabulary we understood before. How should we understand these two stages of the process? Are they I've reparaphrased McDowell now. Are they actually separable moments? Are they, as it were, independent stages? In the way in which, it's raining and then the water freezing are independent stages of a process. A first one could happen without the second. And water can freeze because, it bubbles up out of the ground. It doesn't have to rain first for water. Are these, in that sense, independent stages? Or are they, there's a sort of a typo here in the handout, I'm sorry, there should be or are these rather merely what Kant calls analytical unities, mere analytical unities, as we can abstract out these elements of the process. But can we be talking about what we want if we understand these stages as thus externally related to each other? McDowell's proposal is that you're going to get into the bind that you have in all of these areas. You're not going to be able to find a way out of Kantian skepticism as long as you understand these things as merely externally, as genuinely independent stages of process. What that proposal is, and whether one's happy with his way of putting it, is a large topic, which, as I said, I'm putting aside for the moment. The further feature of what he's claiming for the moment, which I want to focus on for the course, just understand what kind of generality his solution has. First, we need to see what he's doing philosophically. A prior claim of his, which I think is quite interesting and missed, is that these problems have the same shape. So maybe some version of his proposal is right. Maybe there's a way of making progress without doing his proposal. Maybe some version of his proposal is right, but the details of it are wrong. Those are all options. But there's a prior claim here, which is that there's a whole raft of problems in contemporary philosophy that have this shape, which I think is a kind of, as I was trying to bring it into view in the previous classes, Kantian problematic, in the sense that I was trying to adumbrate. Now, quickly, what I'm going to do next is the handouts here, partly because I thought I wouldn't have time. So I can do things quickly, and you have something you can take home and read in your living room. See what the slower version might be. What I want to bring out is how the details, that at the level of detail, it's going to be important to McDowell that the problems come up have exactly the same sort of, as it were, logical space into which they fall, if you can get the description right. So we had Davidson and Branham's rejection of empiricism. Empiricism is rejecting empiricism. Empiricism, McDowell describes as the idea that experience can so much as be a tribunal. So to reject empiricism is to reject the idea that there could be external constraint on the sphere of the conceptual. Sellars' book is called Empiricism, the Philosophy of Mind. Branham understands the title roughly to be Empiricism versus the Philosophy of Mind. Empiricism turns out to be the bad guy. I was suggesting that a proper reading of this book, empiricism, Sellars himself wants to be an empiricist. He wants to defend the version of empiricism. But you might say the problem is with what actually Sellars quite explicitly calls traditional empiricism. But empiricism here then is the idea that we can vindicate some notion of external constraint, the sort I was explicating at the beginning of today's class. McDowell says he wants to see the fundamental idea of empiricism, that we can trace our knowledge, we can trace the application of our concepts, or what we take to be true, our worldview, to experience, to something that bears on it from the outside, is a kind of truism, which he thinks you have to reject if you get to the place where Davidson and Branham do. I've already sort of said that I think that's not Sellars' own view. Sellars is criticizing a mythical conception of the given. So he's criticizing traditional empiricism, which I've tried to describe here quickly in item 3. And then I'm going to just skip because we've done some of this. In item 7, we have McDowell's way of putting it, which is to say that, to borrow the vocabulary I was using a moment ago, any understanding of the perceptual process as a two-stage process itself is what causes the problem. It's a way of putting what McDowell is going to want to be arguing. I have a different way of putting this in 7. Now, what I want to bring out in 4, and now I'm really trying to go back to Dixon's question finally, is how McDowell thinks that the philosophy of perception, philosophy of action case has the same structure. So, if Cartesianism is the conception of the inner as a self-standing realm, then you have a kind of seed of Cartesianism here too. But you have it now in a certain conception of what we might call practical intelligence. We're thinking of practical intelligence as something that takes place in an intermental sphere. What it is to intend something or to decide something is for something to happen in my mind here. That happens first on this picture of philosophy of action. And it's something that lies behind any physical manifestation. You might say there's a sense in which, on this picture, what practical intelligence is, you can't actually see me intending something. You can see my face, you can see my body, but the intention is always behind. All you can see is the stuff. You can't see the intention any more than you could see the pain in the other mind's case. The intention is hidden. It unfolds there in that inner mental sphere, in principle separable from anything publicly available. That's the original sort of Cartesian picture. And once you get into a Kantian problematic, all parties will want to disown that picture. Davidson, Brandom, Sellars. One thing they all agree with is, well, they don't be Cartesians. That's a kind of mysterious, picture of what intention is. The question is, how do we make it unmysterious? McDowell would say, as we get into the Kantian problematic, the crucial assumption actually stays put there. The way of domesticating the crucial assumption just exacerbates the bind, so that it takes on the Kantian shape. Where now, the problem is not understanding, how can I tell which intention he has? Or how can I tell which of my experiences is true? But it becomes mysterious how anything could be a reason for an action, how anything could be an experience of a state of affairs, a sensory experience of a state of affairs. It's useful here, I think, to think about what it means to be a pragmatist for a moment. That's what I have under 2. Lots of people want to say they're pragmatists. I was going to talk about this a little more with some examples, but I'll just be quick. But another thing, many of these people agree on Putnam, Sellars, Rorty, McDowell, Brandom, is that they're all in some sense pragmatists. Not a lot of people at the moment will say, I'm not a pragmatist in any sense. But what is it to be a pragmatist in philosophy? Well, one thing you might have thought it would mean, especially in philosophy of action of all areas, is that practical thought informs actions themselves. That you can't understand what thought is apart from a story of action. Brandon will say something like that. Well, what does that mean? And I think it's useful to think about the following kind of a case. Think about, say, tennis, or maybe ping pong would be even better. Table tennis, since the two players are standing so close to each other. Say I'm a good table tennis player. I serve, you hit the ball. I go like that. I return the ball beautifully. I don't just return the ball, I return the ball with spin. I don't just return the ball with spin, but I return the ball with spin to that part of the table where you're not standing, so you're in bad position, so you can't reach it. I did it like that. Now, what do you want to say about this? I've closed the gap. In my initial philosophy of action example, it was, I think I'll open the door. Open it. So it's easier to think, well, it's the intention, it's the cause, it's prior to the action it brings. So we have a causal picture. Part of our causal picture here is one in which we want to sort things in time. So in understanding the intention as the cause, we want it to be temporally antecedent. And now let's go back to the ping pong. Is there intelligent action here when I'm playing ping pong? Is there intentional action? Whereas I think sports are a very interesting case of this. The guy hits a goal from 30 feet in the football match and Norway beats Scotland. Did he intend to put the ball right there? Did he intend nothing? The ball bounced off him? There are such cases. If the ball just bounces off you, goes in. You can usually tell the difference. Not always, which is itself interesting. So, what does practical intelligence look like here? Do we want to say that I incredibly quickly form the intention of moving over here? Do we want to have how I position my feet be part of the intention? Say they're 9 centimeters apart. Do I intend to put them 9 centimeters apart? Seems too precise. Do I intend to put them somewhere between 15 and 5 centimeters apart? Did I intend to put the spin on the ball? Did I intend to put that much spin? Did I form all of those intentions prior to acting? Do I want to say about the intentions? You start doing that, it looks like, a lot of stuff is happening really quickly in here. Really quickly. Which I don't even remember doing. Gee, I forgot forming all those intentions. Hard to remember intentions when you form 23 of them in a quarter of a second. Or should we say, it's instinctive behavior? That's not intentional action. He's just got really well-refined instincts. That's another thing you could say. Then we can bring it completely back into the space of nature as non-conceptually describable. He's just developed this instinct, like an animal or a certain kind of well-tuned machine, so that he moved like that when the ball went there. His understanding of the rules of the game, his understanding of position, his understanding of mixing up his shots, changing his spin. None of that mattered. It was just instinct. There are things we do just on instinct. You throw something and I catch it. I think that probably is a merely instinctive action. Is this just the extension of instinct? So, this is a way of trying to make vivid. What would it be to say, McDowell wants to say, that we need a conception of action in which we haven't described the action itself unless we see the action as intentionally structured as such. We're not going to be describing somebody who is an agent, either if we interiorize the picture of intention. So intentions are external to the actions. Or if we try to understand these are two sides of the same coin, so I don't know if or is really the right word here. We try to understand the actions themselves as events in the physical world, the significance of which, the nature of which we can understand as a kind of achievement, independent of the conceptual capacities which they themselves are realizing in the action itself. There's a distinction that Searle has between two kinds of intentions in action, which I was going to discuss briefly. Some of you might be familiar with. In the bottom of the second to last page. And part of the point is that distinction is going to look very suspicious if you have McDowell's view. That is, the idea that there's a sharp distinction there is itself an expression of a two-stage picture of what intentional action has to be. In the rest of the handout, I have a bit more about what McDowell's own picture on action would look like, 4, 5, and 6 on the last page. But let's skip to two further topics that I want to talk about today. So I'll let the handout itself carry the rest of that class. You can look at this at home. You might also particularly want to look carefully at pages 89 to 91 of Mind and World, which I'm suggesting is a kind of replay of the previous chapters with respect to a different issue, philosophy of action. Seeing how the same set of considerations can play themselves out over a number of philosophical topics, I'm suggesting, as part of understanding why McDowell is putting things the way he is in the first place when he's describing the philosophy of perception case. He's carefully trying to put things so it has that sort of generality. Now, the two things I want to discuss very quickly, we can come back to these issues later in the course, but I just want to sort of plant a bookmark for each of these. First is now McDowell's understanding of the relationship between Cartesian and Kantian skepticism. I think he's he's not his vocabulary for it quite. But I think he's got a worked out view about this. If you read the pages 89 to 91 sequence, you'll see on page 90 there's actually a footnote. It's briefly about this, where he discusses Ryle and what he calls Cartesian philosophy of mind. It says there that he thinks that in the kind of problem that's there being discussed as a dualist problem in Ryle, the ghost in the machine, the mind is this funny kind of mental stuff, sitting inside a physical housing, that involves an inchoate awareness of what later comes into focus. Quoting from page 98, when the problem is recast in Kantian terms. Or, more explicitly, I think this is the topic of the whole of section 3 of the introduction, which, for the purposes of this course, would be a fine thing to read carefully in Mind and World. If Putnam read section 3, the introduction, carefully, I think it'd be much harder it'd be much harder for him to have written what he did in the Dewey Lectures in the way he aligns himself with McDowell. Starts out by McDowell saying this is Roman 13 of the introduction. It may seem surprising that I'm associating empiricism with a philosophical anxiety about the possibility of thought. Surely, it may be objected, empiricism is an epistemological position. The relevant question should rather be this: how is it possible for there to be empirical knowledge? How can our thoughts, how can our experiences have empirical content? But how can we know? Shouldn't that be the question? My suggestion is that's a Cartesian question. And what McDowell's trying to do is something that touches that by clarifying what he thinks the real worry is. And then he goes on to spell that out throughout section 3, which I'll let you read yourself, but I'll just draw attention to this sentence towards the bottom of that page. It's true that modern philosophy is pervaded by apparent problems about knowledge in particular. But I think it's helpful to see those apparent problems as more or less inept expressions of a deeper anxiety, an inchoately felt threat that a way of thinking we find ourselves falling into leaves mind simply out of touch with the rest of reality, not just questionably capable of getting to know about it. Our problem about crediting ourselves with knowledge is just one shape and not the most fundamental in which the anxiety can make itself felt. So I take this to mean something like the following: that he thinks that if you think through a Cartesian problem, if you really come to grips with what you're committed to in a Cartesian picture, if you get a formulation of what the structure of the picture is, you'll see it's hopeless. You can't solve it as set up. And as you think it through, it will turn into a Kantian problem. You might say, it'll turn out to have a false bottom, which will drop out, and you'll suddenly realize that actually, if you think more clearly about your problem, it has a Kantian shape. And if you can resolve the problem in its Kantian form, you'll see you can't even set up its problem in the Cartesian form. So you don't wind up answering the people that have the Cartesian problems by accepting the shape of the problem and saying, oh yes, but we can bridge the gap. We don't use God, we have this better equipment. Rather, the gap itself seems suspect in the form that it's set up, in a way that can be given precise articulation once you've thought through the Kantian problem. That, I think, is McDowell's sort of general view about how these problems are connected. I think the essay of his that brings that out best is an essay which is collected in this book, which is called Singular Thought and the Extent of Inner Space. And I've asked Richard and Conant to make copies of this, and I thought when we discuss criteria, diffusibility, and knowledge next week, we discuss that essay too. And what I'm really interested in is the middle sections of that essay, sections 4, 5, and 6. There, the discussion, again, like so often in McDowell, he starts with a particular philosophical problem. Here it's the relation of sense and reference. But his discussion in those middle essays about how a Cartesian problem is related to a Kantian problem, those aren't his way of putting it, but you'll see his way of putting it, is put in a way that is meant to have a kind of generality, so that we can see how what's coming into focus in this essay is simply a species of a more generic kind of philosophical applying. It's not somehow particularly a feature of having started by thinking about, say, sense and reference. So it's really those middle sections that we'll focus on, because I don't want to go into all the background in Frege and Russell that's forming that problem, but I partly chose it for people of those interests, partly as a way of multiplying kinds of paper topics. And anyone who would like to talk about the frame of those sections, I'd be glad to discuss it. Second thing I wanted to talk about in conclusion, very quickly, is therefore the relationship between McDowell and Putnam we were discussing before. In the light of what we've seen today, let's think for just 2 seconds about Putnam and McDowell. We can put Putnam's point in the Dewey lectures as follows. The fundamental problems in philosophy ultimately stem from the interface conception. If we can just get clear about that, that is, if we can get clear about a certain kind of Cartesian problematic and see why that can't work, we just keep our focus there. We'll see what's wrong with the problems throughout all these different areas of philosophy. There's a very similar ambition in Putnam and McDowell. And he says that's what Putnam's saying. And that's what Putnam's saying. And that's also what McDowell's saying. My suggestion just now, putting together everything I've said today, using perception, action as 2 examples that I'm asking you to believe me McDowell thinks can be multiplied. And you can see instances of that if you read on his work. McDowell's view is, in a sense, not just not that, but it's exactly the opposite of that. I'm trying to bring out, in a way, how fundamental a misunderstanding this is. Putnam's view is the problems that you encounter when you raise it, as Putnam does, as an issue about how knowledge claims can be answerable to reality, or responsible to reality, is an inchoate, incompletely grasped problem. If you try to answer it in those terms, your answer is always going to be unsatisfying. It's always going to look like a just digging in your heels, or trying to solve with resources that you don't fully have at your disposal. But if you think through the problem, it will collapse into a Kantian problem. And moreover, there are lots of people who are now worried about Kantian problems, which they think are different. So you're merely focusing on the Cartesian problem isn't going to even seem to make contact with them. But if you can conceive of how it is that problems that have the characteristically Kantian sort of shape are like each other and all involve a common misconception of what the problem is, if you can solve them at that level, then you can solve the fundamental problems of philosophy across a number of different areas. So Putnam certainly reads the ambition of what McDowell's doing correctly. But whereas Putnam's saying something like the problems that Kripke, Crispin Wright, Sellars, all those people have, you can solve that by just focusing on the interface conception. McDowell's saying the opposite. He's saying the kinds of problems that Putnam's worried about there, or H.H. Price, or A.J. Ayer, all the people that are focused on a problem that has a Cartesian character have, they need to see how that problem is actually an unclear version of the kind of problem that a Kripke, a Brandom, a Lewis has, and that it's treating it in that form. That's the condition of having a general characterization of what's going wrong across these areas of philosophy. So there's a sense in which, it's a little delicate, but I'm trying to bring out a sense in which they're actually saying exactly the opposite thing. Though it can look like they're saying the same thing. Putnam certainly takes themselves to be saying the same thing. What we're going to do when I come back, the next class I am present at on Wednesday, is we're going to look at Kripke. It's rule following. So we're going to look at, again, these issues in a different context, a philosophy of language context. Now, that's part of why I avoided that context today. And one of the things I want you to think about as you're reading the Kripke is he posing a Cartesian problem or a Kantian problem? How is he putting this? Look at his language. And there's an article, which is the original article version of Kripke's piece, which is what we've made available to you. But there's also a very famous book. And you're welcome to read the book instead of the article if you want. I think the book is less confused than the article. So I'm partly interested in his earlier conception of this in the article. So that's part of the reason I'll focus on it, because I'm interested in it. But anyone who wants to read the book instead, I will also quote some things from the book to try to bring out why I think it's less confused, even though we haven't assigned it.